This might be the perfect follow-up to that because, we've had recent local school board elections, not so recent anymore, across the state. This is behind the hysteria behind CRT and LGBTQ plus identity, expression, literature, whatnot, what have you. So can you speak to the trend of Republican involvement and as a result, many conservative, if not conservative then, conservative now, school board victories that occurred across Texas? This might require a little speculation, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, speculation. And honestly, if you don't mind me setting the context a little bit, because I think it's important, this didn't
Please
just
do.
come out of nowhere, it most recently, was a real backlash to the uprising of summer 2020 when, probably the biggest threat to the power establishment that we've seen in a long time, led by young people saying we are going to talk about systemic racism and we're going to talk about actual solutions and addressing, the long legacy and continued white supremacy that is embedded in this country. And so that's the immediate kind of precipitating cause. But it goes back way further. We've always had battles in this country about what students are going to talk about in schools, how, going back to who would be allowed to have a public education, about integrating schools, about funding schools, about how to talk about war and patriotism. And, this is an ongoing conversation that we've been having for a very, very, very long time. And I also think it's important to say that a lot of, and sorry, I'll get to the question in a second.
No, you're good. Yeah.
Just to kind of set the stage, I think the other thing that's important to say is when you actually dig down into what we see happening, which is book banning, curriculum censorship, and teachers getting fired for, just saying we want our school to be equitable for all of our students, are facing repercussions for that. That's really, really, really unpopular. When you dig down into the specifics and you ask people, is this what you want in your school district? The vast majority of people and an overwhelming majority of students and parents are absolutely not. This is the opposite of what we've been asking for. Students, community members, parents have been calling for more equity, more conversation about race and gender, more community involvement in schools. And so this is not representative of what most people want out of their schools. It is, however, really centered in districts. And this is, this great study that came out a few months ago, looking at 2020 and 2021 at all the school districts that had any sort of public conversation around critical race theory, that the schools that were more likely to see anti-CRT campaigns were the districts where white student enrollment was falling.
Wow.
So districts that were racially diversifying, which is probably, not that surprising, but also is now represented in the data. We know that this is where this is happening. The districts that continue to have pretty high proportions of white students are seeing a lot less of this. So it is very much a response to the diversification of the public school system. And we know that most public school students in Texas are Black, Latinx, increasingly Asian. There's an indigenous population of students as well, of course, and that white student enrollment is dropping. So that's kind of all the context that I think is important to talk about when we talk about this, because there's been a huge, as you said, backlash to all of these things that has been shown in school boards. And it's, like I said, really it is all wrapped up together in this far right, takeover from everything to, voter suppression to the rolling back of abortion rights, to, giving up on any semblance of gun control. All of these issues are being funded by the same people, are being supported by the same people, and it's all playing out in local school districts. So even if, you see a district and the representatives of the anti-CRT campaign in that district, maybe they are local parents, but a lot of times they are being funded by national groups who are like deeply connected to this like far right dark money. I think the other thing is to say is like, I think the far right has been really smart about for decades about focusing on local elections and local power structures. Schools are places that all of us, like most people in this country, have gone through a school. Most of us have, current relatives or family or friends or, people in our lives who we know who are in schools. Like schools touch all of our lives. And so in ways that sometimes other policy issues don't seem to directly affect us, like schools are really tangible and close to home for a lot of people. And so the far right has been very, very smart and successful in like focusing their attention on school board races where a lot of change can be made around like what are students talking about? Are students being encouraged to learn about what's happening in their communities? Are they talking about current events? Are they talking about, are they receiving like an honest education about US or Texas history? And we know that like has actual tangible results, right? When people learn about like systemic racism as an issue from a young age, they are much more likely to support systemic solutions, policy solutions. Whereas if we're not having those conversations for, white folks or rich folks or straight folks or anyone who isn't experiencing like marginalization and whatever piece of their identity, who might not be having those conversations or questions about those issues, that it is much harder as an adult to kind of unlearn all the things you've been taught, right? And start to think about like, okay, how is this system actually harming all of us, but particularly the most vulnerable folks, and what's my responsibility to do something about it?
That's awesome. I think that's a great comprehensive answer to the question. So no worries at all to the question. Okay. So I heard you mention earlier other states, Texas is trying to copy some things that Florida is doing. And, we're seeing a lot of parallel between Texas and Florida regarding education and state legislatures. Can you expound on the differences between Texas, Florida, and say a state like California, and how when these states decide what should be taught in their classrooms, it reverberates across the country?
Yeah, for sure. Texas has for a long time been kind of the policy incubator for the rest of the country. And now I think Governor DeSantis in Florida is trying to do the same thing. Like in a lot of ways, him and Governor Abbott are operating on a national level to try and break into like national level Republican politics, right? So they're trying to prove who has the most like far right, who can do the most harmful, outlandish things that will like elevate them to a national scale. So, but any like big state has an outsized impact on the rest of the country's policy, particularly in education. It's often like, this may be a little bit apocryphal, but because Texas has so many students, right? So when textbook manufacturers are like writing textbooks, they have to write them so they can sell them to the state of Texas. Huge market. But those textbooks also get sold to other states. So when they're writing them to Texas's, really restrictive, really whitewashed curriculum, to the restrictive TEKS, that gets like spread out throughout the rest of the country. That's also what other students are learning. Obviously, that is not to say that there aren't, teachers in other states or even teachers within Texas who are amazing, wonderful teachers and are teaching well beyond what the textbook says. But a lot of those like foundational materials are really dictated by what Texas's standards are. And there was this great New York Times comparison a couple years ago, I want to say, that showed the difference between the California version of a textbook and the Texas version of a textbook. Same publisher, same, it was like whatever, 8th grade social studies, 8th grade US history textbook or whatever. And the California version, again, not that as a West Coast girl, like not the California is perfect, but the California version went into like the queer liberation movement, or talked about like labor unions, or gosh, what are some other examples? Just went into, or talked, I think there were some examples too, perspectives from Indigenous folks living in California about like what their tribes had looked like before white colonizers came in and what their existence is like today. All this really, really like great, comprehensive, like different perspectives. And then you get to the Texas version and it's like all stripped up and none of that is there.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a really good kind of comparison of what different students are having, like what the baseline of what they're getting exposed to and talking about in the classroom looks like. And then I think, the way now we see with social media and all these kind of national level groups who are funding so many of these bills, when something like, Senate Bill 3 that passed here is successful here, that language gets like replicated in other states. And so, like I said, we're kind of the testing ground for a lot of things, and then other states pick up on it and run with it too.
Wow, so that's kind of a daunting task to kind of overcome because Texas has such a high population, but
yeah. But I should also say, like, I think, we also are an example of like, there are so many amazing, I was talking about all the amazing Texas-based advocates and organizers who I get to work with, you among them, like earlier. I think Texas is also a really great example of what can happen when there is a concerted, like local effort to push back against some of these things. I mean, we've seen like school board victories by these far-right extremists, but we've also seen students and their parents and teachers and community members band together to show up at school board meetings en masse and fight back against book bans, or support local city council or school board members who are really like responsive to what people actually need. And so for as much as, policy-wise, we export some pretty dangerous and damaging policies to the rest of the country, I also think there's a real like model for how to push back and how to organize with each other to make this a better state for all of us, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And Texas has such a unique kind of demographic landscape. Black people are maybe 12 to 14% of the population, but out of all the states in the nation, we have the highest pure amount of Black people in the population. So it's really a testing ground for organization and organizational tactics. So
yeah,
I totally agree with you there.
Yeah.
All right. So thought experiment. What would be the state of education in Texas in, let's say, 20 years? If those in power are able to do whatever they want, put in place whatever they want, all that they want in our education system. And since you study the Texas legislature, even beyond the education system.
I mean, I don't even think we have to speculate. Like, they have said what they want to do for the past, since Brown v. Board passed, like what the goal is. And it's to abolish like the public school system. That's the end goal. They want to privatize the school system so that the only education that folks receive is like a white Christian nationalist education, if that word can even be used anymore, but like indoctrination into those principles. And that's what we have heard over and over again from the leaders of this movement, that's their goal, to abolish public. Because honestly, like public education, if we didn't have it and it was proposed in the US today, it like public libraries, like no one would go for it. It wouldn't be something that we could have the political will probably to create today. But it's so integral to the United States as a country, like that every single state constitution has a right to a public education written into it. Texas's, because it had to rejoin the Union after the Civil War, like it was a requirement that we guaranteed the right to public education. But the way that we've seen, like in the South, like Black folks who were enslaved creating education systems for themselves and for their children. And after the Civil War, the way that like education was one of the first things that people created. Even back to like the founding of this country, the way that, pretty much everyone who we consider like a founding father or important to the founding of the US, was writing about public education as like a cornerstone of democracy. Which is why I, say like the attacks on public education and the attacks on our right to vote are the same attack, and being led by the same people. But public education is integral to continuing to have, the imperfect democracy that we have, but also strengthening it and creating like an actual representative country that we can all participate in. And so the goal is to destroy it, and weaken all of those like community supports.
Yeah, it seems to be their plan, and it seems to be well underway. I'm reading this book right now by a man named Dr. Martin Carnoy. It's called Education as Cultural Imperialism. And most people probably wouldn't read it. It's a Marxist analysis of the genesis of our education system, or just education systems around the world under this capitalist system. And I think it's important that we understand the genesis of that so we can combat what they're trying to do now. I think it's important because the contradiction within that is that, you need to use the education system to create a citizen that you want, i.e. a worker bee, someone who's not going to make too much noise. But at the same time, that access to education allows the expansion of imagination and thoughts, and that's going to lead to a revolutionary outcome. And so I think it's important that we do things like this thought experiment so we know which way we're headed and what we need to do as private, organized individuals to combat the trajectory of what they're trying to do, because they make it plain, they don't hide it, and they do it 100% full force. Yeah. So part of the way that we're going to be able to dismantle that is by educating ourselves about these systems, which is why I appreciate everything that you do so much, because I don't have the capacity to figure out what the State Board of Education and the Texas legislature is doing, as well as organizing locally, reading, writing, and studying. So I think it's awesome what you're doing.
Well, thank you. And that's just to pick up on that point. Like I think it's important that we have this conversation and talk about like how important public education can be and should be, while also saying like we have failed generations of students with our public education system by not investing in schools through a school to prison pipeline that sends Black and brown students and disabled students like straight into the criminal legal system. Like, by all means, the system that we have is not only imperfect, but like actively harmful to many students, right? And so we don't have to defend what exists, but we can say like, as we talk about what we have right now, where the far right wants to take us, what is our vision of what public education actually could be? And it's not, a laboratory to develop future Amazon workers. It's not like a babysitting for kids while their parents work 9 to 5s and never get to like see their children. It can be something much more radical and empowering than that. So I appreciate you saying that, because that's a good.
No, yeah, that's awesome. That's really good. That's really good. Okay, so as we close, I got one more question, and we've kind of hinted at it throughout this whole interview, but I just wanted to know, with the recent Supreme Court decision and Roe v. Wade being overturned, the constant discourse about who is or who should be a Supreme Court judge and whatnot. Can you speak to a little bit more about the connection between this CRT scare, the recent education policy that have been implemented, and these wave of Supreme Court decisions that have been coming down? And as you mentioned before, how it's a threat to Brown v. Board of Education and what that really means for all of us.
Yeah. They're absolutely all connected. On a, financial level, the same groups that have been funding like the far right takeover of the courts are the same ones that are funding the far right takeover of school board districts across the country. And on an ideological level, we've, seen in this court's decisions with, justices who were very much selected by like the Judicial Crisis Network, for example, who's one of those dark money groups who's been funding all of this, that their end goal is to roll back all of the rights that have been won since the civil rights era. And one of the, Roe v. Wade obviously is a huge example. There were also court cases this term where, they've been steadily like eroding the separation between church and state, saying that, it's clear that their end goal is for government to, and our money to have to fund private religious education that discriminates against students, that doesn't accept, LGBTQ plus students who are not white conservative Christians. So, that those court cases have been happening, and also all the cases that we've seen eroding abortion rights and gun rights. Again, like it is all part of the same goal, right? And I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on the courts, so I don't know if there's like a future where they overturn Brown v. Board the same way that they have overturned Roe v. Wade. But I do think there's a future where, I guess it is sort of similar in the sense that, the Supreme Court says like this isn't a federal decision and sends it back to the states. And then, of course, we know what states like Texas will immediately do. So yeah, I think there is absolutely a threat, if not to like the actual legal standard of Brown v. Board, to the precedent or goal, I guess, that we should have integrated school systems, which again, like we don't in a lot of places. In most cases, schools are just as segregated as they were. But to at least have like the legal protections, or the idea that we should have an integrated public education system, and that's a federal right that the federal government would step in to protect. I do absolutely think there's a threat to that kind of ideal.
Wow. Well, this has been an enlightening, illuminating, and sobering conversation. Maggie Stern, thank you so much for your time and your energy and your effort. Will you let everybody know how they can follow you, look at your work, reach out to you and whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can follow the work I do with Children's Defense Fund at CDF Texas on pretty much any social media platform. Follow me personally on Twitter, I guess, if you want, at Maggie Ann 5713. I think that's right. But yeah, all of our stuff through Children's Defense Fund is very much focused on supporting students to speak up and advocate for the issues that they believe in, particularly around their education. So that'd be a good place to start.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I hope that we can do this again. We can stay in touch and on top of these issues. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and for this interview with Maggie Stern of CDF Texas. Maggie, last words.
Oh, man. Yeah, I feel like we've spent a lot of time talking about how dire things are, which is true. Like, absolutely. I think we need to be honest about the really huge threat that we are facing to the state, to the country, from white supremacy and Christian nationalism. And like I said, I think that, there's one of the things that I guess gives me some hope when I think about, how many different levels like we've talked about all the different levels from the local to the state to the federal that these conversations and fights are happening on, is that means there is a space in all of those spaces for people to step up and push back and imagine a better future than the one we are currently on the track for. So I guess if I can end on a note of optimism, but at least I get a lot of hope from getting to work with amazing organizers who are really honest about the threats we're facing and wake up every morning and do the work anyway and make their little corner of the world a better place. So